prisons here in the U.S. are still dealing with a surge. A new article from Stat takes a closer look at what the Biden administration has or hasn't done to address the issue after President Biden vowed to protect prisoners. So Nicholas Florko wrote that piece. He's a Washington correspondent for Stat, and he's here to talk more about this. So when I was going through, your article, I was thinking, like the best remedy that we've seen so far is to offer early release or home confinement because they didn't seem to be a way to control the COVID outbreaks in prisons since the very start of this pandemic. How bad is the situation now, though? And now we have vaccines and presumably we know a lot more about the virus.
Yeah, so things were particularly bad over the month of January. Several prisons throughout the country were seeing triple-digit spikes in new cases in just a week's time. And these are not huge facilities. I mean, one prison that holds roughly 700 people, for example, they saw over 200 new cases in 1 week alone. And the data suggests that the numbers do luckily seem to be leveling off in February. But these spiking cases really spotlighted that many aspects of the BOP's COVID response have remained broken 2 years after the pandemic. We're seeing prisons dealing with really quite basic issues, things like staff not isolating positive COVID cases, test results coming back very delayed. These are issues 2 years into the pandemic that have really demonstrated that the BOP's response still has some major issues.
So, Nick, President Biden promised to order the Bureau of Prisons to reevaluate its COVID-19 protocols on his first full day in office. What's happened since?
So, as you mentioned, Biden's COVID strategy did include some pledges related to fixing the Bureau of Prisons. Those were part of Biden's larger pledge to ensure that the COVID response is equitable. One of those pledges was to vaccinate the prison population. The other was to issue an executive order directing the Federal Bureau of Prison to reevaluate its protocols. The executive order actually didn't happen at all, which is quite shocking. Advocates that I spoke to argue that the Federal Bureau of Prisons protocols are just as broken as they were during the Trump administration. I'm happy to go into it. The vaccine effort has gone slightly better, but advocates are really frustrated that Biden made these promises to fix the response to COVID in prisons, and that largely hasn't happened.
Yeah, so talk about the vaccine rollout. How is it going? Do they have the vaccine that they need? Can prisoners say no to the vaccine if they don't want to get it?
Yes, prisoners definitely can say no to the vaccine if they don't want to get it. A DOJ spokesperson told me last week that just shy of 70% of the federal prison population is fully vaccinated, which is a number that they should be applauded for. That number is actually much lower, though, for boosters. The latest data that I've seen suggests that roughly 20% of people in federal prison have been boosted, despite the fact that we now know that boosters provide the best level of protection against getting seriously ill from COVID. And reports from inside prisons actually suggest that often the most medically vulnerable, those that have medical questions about the vaccine because they have other high-risk conditions, they just want to make sure that this is not going to mess with their hepatitis or their hypertension. Those questions aren't getting answered, and thus those people are often refusing the vaccine. So the campaign is leaving behind the most vulnerable in our prison population.
So to that, Nick, how is the Justice Department responding?
So the DOJ largely defended its response to COVID in response to my story. They really applauded their own efforts to get the prison population vaccinated. And they said that reports, for example, in prisons that staff are not following public health guidelines are basically aberrations and could lead to disciplinary action for those staff members. I should also say that I reached out to the White House for this story, and their response was actually more interesting, I think. They argued that the Biden White House has actually achieved its goals. And they actually pointed to an older executive order related to protecting the federal workforce as an example of how they protected the Bureau of Prisons. The problem is that that executive order actually was released before Biden made his promises relating to fixing the prison system, and that executive order doesn't actually mention prisons at all. So it's quite a perplexing situation, but both the DOJ and the White House largely have defended their response.
That is quite an interesting response because, I literally just sort of Google COVID and prison, and you get all sorts of articles about early release to protect people from COVID, prisoners demanding more protection from COVID. It's not, the job is not done yet.
That's right.
To say the least.
But the reporting is excellent. Nick Florko, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.